All right, we are starting chapter 5, section 4. This has to do with isosceles and equilateral triangles. You guys are having a quiz on Tuesday. Okay, so tomorrow's a half day. We're going to do review. We're going to do review Monday, then you're taking your test on Tuesday. What do we know about isosceles triangles? Can anybody tell me? What do we know about isosceles?
One side is greater than 90.
The two sides.
Two sides are the same. That's the key thing about isosceles triangles. When you're talking about degrees, it's angles. Isosceles is just talking about my sides. What about equilateral triangles? All sides are going to be the same, okay? So that's what we're covering. Looking at this, parts of isosceles triangles, there are important parts that we need to know. When we're dealing with isosceles triangles, we already said that two sides are going to have the same measure. So looking at this, that's given. They're called my legs, okay? These two right here are going to be congruent. They're called legs. The bottom part, which is not going to be congruent to anything else, is called my base. Think of it as your triangle is sitting on a base. The side that is by itself, the measurement that is by itself is considered your base. We have to know for isosceles triangles, if you have two sides that are congruent, you will also have two angles that are congruent. And using the angles that are congruent, they're considered my opposite angles. So how we can determine if it's opposite is if you're looking at this side in blue, okay, one of my legs, if you draw an arrow through it, straight through it, it's going to show which angle is opposite. So looking at it, this is going to be an opposite angle right here. And I'm going to do it to the other side that is also congruent and draw a line straight through. And this one is also going to be congruent. So now I have two congruent angles. Okay, two congruent sides, two congruent angles. I also want you guys to be aware that your triangle will not always be sitting on its base. On a test or quiz, you may see a triangle that is upside down. These two sides are still considered my legs because they're congruent. And this is still going to be considered my base, which is also congruent. Okay? So looking at the triangle that I drew, I'm going to label it ABC. Can someone tell me which angles will be congruent? Remember, angles, I'm naming it by one letter. Which angles would be congruent? I have my two sides. Here's one side. Here's another side. Which angles will be congruent? Does anybody have an idea? Remember, it's your opposite. So, which angles would be congruent? Angle A, angle B, or angle C? I have to name two. Which two? Jane?
Is it angle A and B?
Angle A and B. Okay, so angle A and angle B. Again, if you're looking at it, please understand this because this will help you. When we get to chapter 9, you have to know opposites. If I were to draw an arrow, it's pointing to this side. If I were to draw an arrow, it's pointing to this side. Keep in mind that arrow's going straight through my corner and it's going to the opposite side. Questions on this? Okay. All right, base angle theorem. We are covering 4 theorems. You have to know the theorems, so please make sure you are studying the theorems. Please listen to the verbiage as I read it. It says, if two sides, so I'm talking about sides first, so I'm going to highlight that. If two sides of a triangle are congruent, then the angles opposite to them are congruent. So I'm going from sides to angles. Again, I am drawing my lines. Here are my sides. And I'm pointing to the angle that is congruent. So this angle is congruent. This angle is congruent. So base angle theorem, I'm going from sides to angles. Okay, going from sides to angles. So please make sure you know that. If two sides are congruent, then the two opposite angles are congruent. Any questions on this? Okay, don't get mixed up with base angle theorem and the next theorem we're going to cover, which is converse. Remember, we covered inverse, converse, contrapositive. We covered all that, and all we did was switch them. So now instead of me going from sides to angles, I'm going to be going from two angles. God bless you. I'm going to be going from angles to sides. Again, two angles. If two angles are congruent, then that's going to mean the opposite sides are congruent. So I'm going to draw my opposite sides. If I were to draw a line straight through, it's pointing to those sides. So now I know which sides are going to be opposite. This side and this side. So for converse, that's the key. We're covering the converse. I'm just switching it around. Now I'm going from angles to sides. Okay, do we see the difference? One is going from sides to angles, but now I'm going from angles to sides. And let me draw my congruency marks. Please make sure you know how to draw your congruency marks for your sides and how to draw your congruency marks for your angles. All right, questions on these two theorems? You're going to have to know them because you guys will have a proof on the test. Not on the quiz, but on the test. All right, you're going to answer this one on your own. Try and do it on your own. It says, in triangle DEF, side DE is congruent with side DF. Name the two congruent angles. Go ahead on your own without shouting out. Try and name your congruent angles by yourself. All right, so I'm going to highlight what's what. They told me that DE right here is congruent to DF. And they gave you those congruency marks. So if you're looking at your congruency marks, okay, what are my angles? You could tell me what my two angles would be that are congruent. What would my two angles be, Tyler?
Angle F congruent to angle E.
Good, angle F is congruent to angle E. How am I writing it? Please make sure you're writing it correctly. Angle F is congruent to angle E. And if you want, whichever way is correct. Okay, specifically talking about those angles again, if you want to check, draw it. Which angle is this pointing to? This side. Which side is this angle pointing to? This side. Those two are my sides that were congruent, so those two are my angles that are congruent. Any questions on this? Corollaries. Corollary to the base angle theorem. So we should know what base angle is after we practice it. Base angle is going from my sides to my angles, but now I'm dealing with an equilateral triangle, meaning all my sides are equal. So looking at it, we have corollary to the base angle theorem. And same thing as base angle theorem, I'm going from my side. Okay, equilateral is telling me my sides are equilateral, to my angles, which is equiangular. So it kind of says the word angle in there. I'm going from sides to angles. And corollary to the converse of base angles. So now I'm dealing with the converse side. So now I'm switching it and I'm dealing with, again, equilateral triangles. So instead of going from sides to angles, I'm going from angles to sides. Okay, so these are theorems you just have to practice and you have to know them. Questions on corollary. All right, we're going to do some examples. Please follow along with the examples. If you get stuck on one, definitely ask, because we need to clarify so you guys do well on this quiz. They want us to just find the value of x. So looking at this triangle, I'm going to give you some letters. I highly suggest you write letters on here just so it's easier so we can name it. Looking at this, it's an isosceles triangle. Okay, they're telling me that this side right here, AB, is congruent to AC. If those sides are congruent, can somebody tell me the two angles that are congruent? Which two angles here would be congruent? Now is the time to try and test yourself to see if you know it. Oliver, did you say it? Good. Angles B and angle C is going to be congruent. Let me draw my congruency marks. All right, so I'm just going to write angle B would be congruent to angle C. So if they're telling me angle C is x, what should angle B also be? X. Now I have to solve for x. What does the inside of my triangle equal? Good. Go ahead and try and solve this on your own. See if you know how to solve for x. Try and do this one by yourself. I see that a lot of you guys already have the answer, so I'm just going to kind of go over it. If I know that the inside of my triangle is 180, and I need to find my two x's, there's a couple ways you can do this. I see that the easier way from what I've seen throughout the day, most students just do the 180 minus 30, and they get 150. That 150 means my two x's have to be added together to equal 150. So what would I have to do with my 150?
Divide by 2.
All I have to do is divide it by 2. And you'll get 75. That's one way to do it. Okay, another way that I've seen people do it is they have 30, plus I have two x's equals 180. They're setting it up as an equation. I would then just solve for x. So subtract 30. It's still the same concept. I'm still going to get the same answer. It's just a different way of writing it. 2x equals 150. Divide both sides by 2. And I'm still going to get x equals 75. So my answer would be x equals 75 degrees. Any questions on A? All right, hopefully we're getting it now. All right, looking at B. A, B, C. Okay, looking at this one, they're giving me my angles. Okay, they're telling me angle A is congruent to angle C. Who could tell me which two sides would be congruent? Okay, what was it? All right, B and C. Okay, but remember they have to be congruent. So opposite angles. Good. BC is congruent to AB. Again, if you're not sure, draw your arrows to find that opposite side. So I'm going to draw my congruency marks. So because I know those two are congruent, how would I set this up? How would I set this up to solve for x?
2x minus 4 equals x.
Perfect. Do I need this right here? No. They're just giving you information you don't need, so I'm going to go ahead and just cross it out. I don't need it. Because just by this equation, I can solve for x. Go ahead and solve for x. All right, good. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract my x from both sides of my equal sign. These are going to cancel out. I'm going to get x minus 4 equals 5. Add 4 to both sides. And then I'm going to get my answer, x equals 9. And I'm done. All right, questions on B. All right, let's go ahead and do C. All All right, looking at C, I can't tell if this is an equilateral triangle. Well, I can tell if it's equilateral and it's not. I just have to figure out if it's an isosceles triangle and which sides and angles are equal. So first thing I would figure out is I'm going to figure out this missing angle right here. How would I figure out my missing angle? Yeah. You what? At the bottom two angles, so 56 plus 62, I'm going to get 118, and then what do I have to do? All right, so yes, subtract from 180, and what would I get? Good, I would get 62. And now because I know this is 62, I'm able to tell that this angle is congruent to this angle. So which two sides are congruent? So because I know the two angles, which two sides are congruent? B and C? Okay, A and B is congruent to what?
C and B.
C and B, so let's try this. If I drew my arrows, okay, this one goes here, but there's no angle here. So it can't be B and C. So what would it have to be? Okay, so these two, we said A and B, which was correct. And then A and C would also have to be equal. So what would my x equal? What would x equal? If this side is 42, what should this side also be? 42. So x is going to equal 42 degrees. So you really have to try and look at them and be able to tell what's your angles and what's your sides. Do we have any questions on C? Because that one I feel like was the hardest for most classes. Any questions on C? Carlos?
I didn't get the last part of finding 42.
So you have to find, we found the congruent angles. Okay, we found these two congruent angles. This one and this one. Now we just have to figure out which sides were congruent. So if I started with this side and drew an arrow, it's connecting with this angle. If I drew from this side, it's connecting with this angle. It's the opposite. So that's how you can tell which sides are congruent. By looking at the opposite.
Well, how do you find the 42?
Because this side is 42, this side is also going to be 42. It's actually not degrees. So that's how I'm getting my 42. Good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, proof. Place statements in an appropriate order for the proof and provide reasons. So they're already giving me the proofs. I just have to put it in order. So I'm going to write my statements and my reasons. Statements, reasons. First statement is going to be which one? My first reason is going to be given, yes. And what's the information that's given? Good. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, so I'm done with that one. I'm also going to go over to my diagram, and I'm going to label that. Angle 1 is congruent with angle 2. Always label on your diagram to help you find your next step. So looking at the next one. Now, what do I know looking at this diagram? What do I know here? What do I know is going to be congruent? Yeah.
3 and 4.
I can't say 3 and 4 yet.
Okay.
Oh, okay. It's the vertical. So if you're saying 3 and 4, it's a little different. But if you're saying vertical angles, yes. Before I can state that 3 and 4 are congruent, I need to state my vertical angles. I need to state that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4, and angle 3 is congruent to angle 1. Okay, how do I know that? Vertical angles. Vertical angles theorem. Okay, do we all see how I'm getting vertical angles theorem? Now I can state that angles 3 and 4 are congruent. I couldn't state that before because there were no congruency marks. But now because I have my congruency marks, I could go to step 3 and I can say angles 3 is congruent with angle 4. And how would I know that these are congruent? I would know these are congruent by substitution. And with that being said, because I know my two angles are congruent, so looking at this image, that's telling me that my sides will be congruent. And what theorem was that? If you need to scroll back, please go ahead and scroll back. What theorem was that? I'm going from angles to sides. Good. That's going to be my converse. Base angles theorem. Okay, so you have to know those theorems in order to solve the proof. Questions on this one? All right, this one's already giving you the statements. You just have to state the reasonings. So the statements are, M is the midpoint of AB. Angle M, the measure of angle 1 is congruent to the measure of angle 2. And then we're trying to prove that AC is congruent to MB. So looking at the first one, M is the midpoint of AB. What is that?
Given.
That's given. What about the measure of angle 1 is congruent to the measure of angle 2? It's also given. I'm going to go ahead and label. I'm going to label these. M is the midpoint. I'm going to put a dot right here. M is the midpoint of AB. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So always label. The next one states line MB, segment MB is congruent to segment MA. Most of the time, whenever you see a proof that has the word midpoint here, it's always going to follow by definition. So it's going to be definition of midpoint. Because what's midpoint? It's telling me that two ends of my midpoint are going to be congruent. They're going to be equal. So what this one's stating, MB is congruent to MA, is that this side is congruent to this side. And that's what definition of midpoint means. So now I'm going to number 3. Number 3 is stating AC is congruent to AM. So AC is congruent to AM. How would I know that? I know that because they're giving me my two angles, and then I'm stating my two sides. What theorem is that? Angles to sides.
Converse.
Good. This is converse. Base angles theorem. And then looking at the last one, AC is congruent to MB, so they want me to state that AC right here, I'll do it in purple, AC is congruent to MB. How would I know that? If we're looking at what they gave us before, okay, these two are exactly the same, it's just written in opposite directions. If I'm looking at these two, there are two things that you could write for number 4. One could be substitution. Or it could be transitive. Why could it be transitive? If I rewrote this as MA, okay, so let me show you. If I rewrote this as MA, it's the exact same thing. I could just get rid of right here. I could get rid of what's overlapping. right, any questions on this one? No? Okay.